There's something unnatural about boardwalks after dark. Something the sea knows and we've all chosen to forget. What begins as a place of laughter, sunburnt tourists, and melting ice cream transforms into a hollow, echoing path where things hide just beyond the glow of the last street lamp. Beneath the slats of wood and the shadows behind the arcade lights, and within the stalls that never truly close, things wait. Not all vendors pack up, not all performers go home, and not everyone who vanishes from the pier is taken by the tide. These are not campfire tales. These are true accounts drawn from real reports, police logs, and first-hand testimony, unsettling stories of those who encountered something they could never fully explain, and in some cases, never escape. Tonight, you'll hear 4 terrifying true stories of boardwalks and beaches where the familiar twisted into something horrific and the line between reality and nightmare vanished with the tide. But be warned, once you've heard them, the boardwalk may never feel safe again. Story 1. The Boardwalk Watch. I used to work summers at a rickety little souvenir shop on the edge of the boardwalk in Wildwood, New Jersey, the kind of place where faded postcards curled in the salty air and bobbleheads of dancing hula girls collected layers of grit by mid-July. And while I always chalked up the weirdness of my night shifts to the naturally eerie vibe of a decaying beach town after dark, I know now that what I experienced during the summer of 2018 wasn't some trick of atmosphere or paranoia from being alone in the shop at night. It was real, and I think about it every time I hear the creak of wooden planks or the distant call of seagulls. It started with the man who stared through the glass, a tall figure in a too long trench coat who stood perfectly still, his pale, almost waxy face framed by greasy strands of hair that looked too stringy and flat for the humidity we were having. And what struck me the most wasn't his appearance, but the way he stared. Not at me, but at a point behind me, deep in the store, as if something far darker than me had caught his attention. And when I turned around instinctively to look, all I saw was the rack of keychains and miniature lighthouses, gently swaying from the fan I kept running by the register. So when I turned back to the window, he was gone, just like that. No sound, no shadow retreating, no hint of footsteps on the wood outside, and it left me with that crawling, cold-hollowing sensation like when you wake up in the middle of the night and feel like something's in the room with you, but you're too scared to check. The next night, I was closing up around 11:30, and as I locked the front and began sweeping, I noticed the display of pressed penny machines was slightly turned, like someone had twisted the entire frame to face the window, which made no sense because it was a steel unit bolted into the floor. Yet, there it was, angled just enough so that the etched images of pirate ships and dolphins were staring outward. And when I glanced toward the glass, the same man was there again, same coat, same dead eyes, just watching, unmoving, his head tilted ever so slightly like a curious animal observing something it couldn't quite understand. And this time I didn't turn around. I just stared back, daring him to blink, to breathe, to do anything that would confirm he was alive, and not just some horrifying figment of my exhausted imagination. But I blinked first, and again, he vanished like a signal lost in static, and I ran outside, heart jackhammering against my ribs, scanning up and down the empty boardwalk under the flickering amber lights, but no sign of him, no echo of footsteps, just that damp, salty wind carrying the distant tinny sound of carnival music from the closed amusement park 2 blocks down. When I told my manager the next morning, she laughed it off and said I was probably seeing some local burnout or one of the drifters that passed through, but I knew it wasn't that. His clothes were too clean, his posture too rigid, and the way he moved, or rather didn't, was off in that uncanny valley sort of way that makes your spine go cold, and I tried to let it go, chalk it up to stress or lack of sleep, but the sightings continued, and each time they became more specific, more deliberate, once I found every bobblehead in the shop facing the back wall, arranged in perfect lines like they were in some kind of twisted congregation, their heads tilted downward like they were praying, or mourning, or waiting for something I couldn't see. And another time, I opened the cash register and found all the bills folded in half vertically, like someone had been making little paper doors with Washington's face peeking through. And when I looked up, he was there again, this time with one hand pressed flat against the glass, leaving a foggy print with what looked like elongated fingers, almost too many of them. and I swear the smudge remained for hours even after I cleaned it with Windex, like the glass had absorbed something that normal cleaner couldn't erase. I started asking around, locals, old workers, even the homeless guy who collected bottles along the dunes, and that's when I heard about it, the Watcher, a rumor mostly shared as a joke among teenagers and board lifeguards, a boardwalk ghost story about a young man who was seen staring through shop windows after hours, always silent, always still, always watching, and no one knew where the story began or if it was based on someone real, but there were scattered references in old newspaper clippings. E-shop vandalized with no sign of entry. A worker found unresponsive after overnight shift. A witness reports man with no eyes outside arcade. And the deeper I dug, the more it seemed like this wasn't just a joke, that something about this man, or whatever he was, had lingered for decades, always around the same area. Always appearing to lone night workers on the boardwalk, and I began to dread my shifts, begged to work during the day, made up excuses to leave early, but the store was understaffed, and my manager refused, so I started bringing a flashlight, pepper spray, even a pocket knife, none of which helped the night he finally came inside. It was a stormy evening, rain sweeping sideways off the ocean and pelting the glass with needle-sharp intensity, and I was closing up early due to the weather, counting out the till when I heard the distinct sound of the front door chime ring. Sound that should have been impossible, since I had locked it 30 minutes prior, and when I turned, he was standing just inside, dripping wet, trench coat soaked and sticking to his form, revealing just how thin and long-limbed he really was, and his head was tilted in that same unnatural way. If he had eyes locked on mine with such intensity, I couldn't move, couldn't scream, just stood there frozen as he slowly stepped toward me, his wet shoes squeaking against the linoleum, each step too quiet for someone his size, and I backed up until I hit the shelf of snow globes, knocking them over in a cascade of glass and glitter and synthetic snow, and finally my body unlocked and I bolted through the back door, sprinting through the alley behind the shops, rain soaking me instantly. But I didn't care. I ran until my lungs burned and I collapsed in the stairwell of a shuttered seafood place, trembling and gasping like I was about to puke out my soul. And when I finally looked back toward the boardwalk, he was standing in the middle of it, perfectly still, hands at his sides, head tilted, and that's when I realized he had never once tried to chase me. He didn't need to. Only purpose was to be seen and to see, like his presence alone was enough to unravel a person's sanity. I quit the next day, packed up, left town, didn't even ask for my last paycheck, just drove north until I hit the city, and swore I'd never set foot near that boardwalk again. But here's the thing, ever since then, no matter where I go, every now and then, when I pass a storefront or a glass bus shelter, or even a darkened window in my own apartment, I think I see him in the reflection. Tall, wet, still, just watching, and though he's never moved, never followed, never touched me. I wake up some nights to find the closet door cracked just enough that I can see the edge of the mirror inside, and I swear I catch a glimpse of that same pale face and tilted head just for a second before it fades into the darkness like a smudge of fog on cold glass. And maybe it's all in my head. Maybe I fractured something back in that store, or maybe once he sees you, once you've looked back into his empty face and he knows you've seen him, he never really lets you go. Story 2. The lifeguard's last shift. I spent 5 summers working as a lifeguard on the same stretch of boardwalk near Ocean City, Maryland, a quieter section just north of the crowds where the sand was softer, the waves smaller, and the families mostly kept to themselves. And even though the job was dull most days, rescuing tired kids from knee-high currents or breaking up drunk teenagers sneaking beers behind the dunes, I always felt oddly safe in my chair, perched above the sand like some lazy god, with mirrored sunglasses and a whistle I'd barely used. But in 2021, during my final summer before I started grad school, something happened during my last week that I've never been able to explain, something so disturbing and unreal that I haven't returned to a beach since, not even once, because what I saw and what followed unraveled everything I thought I understood about the ocean, about people, about fear, and it all started with a missing swimmer, or at least that's what I thought at the time. It was early evening, A Tuesday with golden light slanting across the water and the usual end-of-day hush falling over the beach, that melancholic quiet just before the sun dropped. And I was doing my final sweep of the shoreline from my chair when I noticed something in the water, a figure floating awkwardly about 30 yards out, arms splayed at an odd angle, face down, bobbing slightly, like someone half asleep or passed out on an invisible raft. And at first, I thought it was just a tourist on one of those inflatable loungers, but something about the way the limbs hung so limp and low suggested something was wrong, so I blew my whistle and scanned the shoreline for movement, calling to the couple packing their cooler and the teenager dragging a metal detector, but no one seemed to notice or respond, and that's when I realized the beach was almost entirely empty. It was just me, the couple in the far corner, and the sound of gulls circling over the garbage bins. I radioed it in, got no answer, which wasn't uncommon. The handhelds often went out during that time of day, and climbed down, jogging across the sand, calling out to the person as I waded into the shallows. And when I got close enough to see the figure clearly, I froze mid-step, ankle deep in warm, foaming water, because the person wasn't floating anymore. They were standing neck deep, completely motionless, facing the shore, directly at me, their eyes wide open and utterly still, like someone in a trance or catatonic state. And even from that distance, I could tell there was something off about their proportions. The neck too thin, the arms slightly too long, the skin pale in a way that didn't look sun-deprived, but wrong, like the color of bone or fungus. And then they moved, just slightly, tilting their head to one side with this jerky, deliberate motion like a puppet being tugged by invisible strings. And I swear to God, I felt this pulse of nausea ripple through my stomach, not because of fear exactly, but because something about that movement, that tilt didn't fit. It wasn't human, or at least not anymore. I backed up, stumbling on the shifting sand, my lifeguard instinct screaming that I was watching a drowning victim, my gut telling me to get the hell away. And then they took a step forward, water swirling around their chest, and I turned and ran straight back to my chair, radioing again, calling out for backup, shouting into the static, but there was no response. And when I finally looked back at the water, the figure was gone, not diving, not retreating, just vanished, as if the sea had swallowed them whole in one blink, and the surface was smooth again, undisturbed except for a single strand of seaweed drifting toward shore. I didn't sleep that night, not even after filing the incident report and having a very bored supervisor chalk it up to a fatigue or a prank by some swimmer who ducked under. But something about the encounter had latched onto my Nissan, brain like a splinter, a creeping feeling that hadn't gone away by the next morning, and I started watching the ocean differently after that. Not for swimmers in distress, but for movement, patterns, rhythms, anything that didn't quite belong. And 2 days later, I saw them again. Not the same person, but the same shape, standing waist deep in the surf, perfectly still, arms at their sides, facing the boardwalk, unmoving as the waves crashed against their body like they weren't even there. And this time I had my binoculars, and when I raised them, I saw a face, but not one I recognized. It was wrong again. Skin that looked stretched too tightly over bone, eyes too far apart, and the strangest part was the mouth. It was open. Not in a scream, not gasping, just slack-jawed and gaping like they were trying to speak but had no sound to give. And when I looked away for a second and looked back, they were gone again, not swimming away, just vanished like a bad edit in a horror film. And this time I felt something else, something deeper, colder, like I was being watched, not just from the water but from behind me, from under the boardwalk itself. And I turned, scanning the length of it, expecting to see someone peeking out between the pilings, but there was nothing, just shifting shadows and sand. And I told myself it was the heat, the stress, the sleepless nights, but I started dreaming of water after that, thick, dark water pressing in on all sides, dragging me down while pale faces watched from below, their mouths all hanging open in that same awful silence. My last shift was the Saturday before Labor Day, and the whole beach was packed, bodies sprawled across towels, kids screaming over melting popsicles, the kind of loud, chaotic day where drownings actually do happen, but there was this heaviness in the air, this stillness beneath the surface that didn't match the noise, and around 3 p.m., I saw something that made my blood turn to ice far out, maybe 50 yards past the swim buoys, a line of heads, 6 or 7, just barely visible. Floating in a perfect row, unmoving, too symmetrical to be accidental, and when I raised the binoculars, I saw that same awful expression on every face, slack mouth, wide eyes, and then, without warning, they all slowly sank at the exact same time, vanishing beneath the waves like synchronized divers. And I stood there shaking, radioing in a panic, drawing attention from other guards who rushed to my tower. And when I told them what I saw, they looked at me like I was either sun poisoned or having a breakdown. And maybe I was. But that night, after I turned in my whistle and walked along the boardwalk one final time, I passed beneath a street lamp and saw a man crouched just under the wooden slats, staring through the gaps at the ocean with that same dead, silent focus. And as I got closer, I realized he wasn't crouching. He was kneeling, bent backwards at an impossible angle, his arms stretched wide like he was praising something I couldn't see. And before I could move or speak, he opened his mouth wide and let out a long gurgling sound like water rushing down a drain, and then he was gone, just gone like the others. No footstep, no movement, just empty space where a body should have been. And I left the boardwalk that night and never returned, never spoke of it to anyone until now, but I've done some research since then. Found records of a phantom drownings and unclaimed bodies stretching back decades in that exact stretch of coastline, stories of people seen walking into the water and never emerging, or lifeguards quitting mid-season after reporting a line of heads in the surf. And I don't know what I saw, what I almost became part of, but I've come to believe there's something beneath the ocean in that place, something old and hungry that mimics the shape of people, drawing us in not with fear but familiarity, a reflection of ourselves stretched just wrong enough to unsettle. And if you stare too long, if you see them and they see you, something opens between you, something silent and wet and dark, and you'll feel it calling you back, always back, because that water doesn't forget, and neither do they. Story 3, the vendor who never left. I took the job selling kettle corn on the boardwalk this summer after my divorce, not because I needed the money. I was still living off the settlement, but because I needed something to keep my hands busy, my mind occupied. Anything to distract from the silence of the apartment and the echo of my own thoughts at night, and it seemed harmless enough. Just a seasonal gig pushing sweet popcorn to drunk tourists and kids, sticky with salt water and soda. A wooden booth wedged between a fish taco stand and one of those places that prints your name on grainy t-shirts. And though the other vendors were friendly in that superficial way, people are when they know you're temporary. Half jokingly at first, the man in the taffy cart at the very end of the boardwalk, the one who never spoke, never seemed to eat or drink, and always opened before sunrise and stayed long after the crowds were gone, even after the lights were shut off and the police started doing their night patrols. And when I asked why he was so strange, the guy at the hot dog kiosk laughed and said, because he's always been there. And though I didn't understand what he meant at first, I'd come to learn that no one knew when the taffy men started working there. He wasn't on the payroll. Oh, and didn't seem to report to anyone, and yet every morning there he was, dressed in the same pale apron, rolling and pulling candy by hand in that old-fashioned machine, while a tinny music box version of You Are My Sunshine had played on loop, and it creeped me out in that subtle way. Not enough to lose sleep over, just enough to make me cross the boardwalk to avoid passing his booth too closely, especially at night when his flickering string lights cast weird shadows across the pavement. But one night, after a particularly long shift, the wind kicked up something fierce, one of those violent coastal gusts that sends napkins, receipts, and umbrellas tumbling into the ocean. And as I was closing down, I noticed that the taffy cart was still open, the figure behind the counter standing perfectly still despite the wind practically knocking down signs and making the whole boardwalk groan. And I swear his string lights weren't flickering from the wind, but from something internal, like faulty wiring or step. And I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was just tired or curious or lonely, but I walked over, thinking I'd finally ask if he needed help or a ride or just talk, and as I approached, I noticed the taffy wasn't candy at all. At least not the way I remembered it as a kid. These weren't pastel ribbons or cheery pink swirls, but long grayish cords that looked more like veins or twisted muscle fibers, coiled into wax paper like medical waste. And the closer I got, the more I realized the music wasn't playing on a speaker. It was coming from inside the cart, somewhere below the counter, too low and too warped to be mechanical, almost like it was being hummed or breathed. And when I finally stood in front of the man, I felt this overwhelming pressure behind my eyes, like a nosebleed coming on or a panic attack starting from inside my skull. And I looked at his face, really looked. And I don't know how I missed it before, but there were no pupils, just milky orbs that shimmered like wet bone. And his mouth wasn't closed exactly, just pressed shut with something like wax, like the taffy itself had fused his lips together. And he slowly lifted one hand, not in greeting, not to wave, but to point behind me. And when I turned around, the boardwalk was empty. Not just devoid of people, but of sound, of movement, of time itself, like the ocean had stopped breathing and the wind had gone silent. And I swear the entire sky looked darker, not from clouds, but from something heavy pressing down. And when I turned back, he was gone, cardinal. Like he'd never been there, though I could still hear the music box faintly, like it had burrowed into my eardrum. I didn't sleep that night, and I told myself it was exhaustion, dehydration, maybe a flashback or hallucination from the stress of the divorce. But the next morning, the taffy man was back, exactly where he always was, and I convinced myself it had been a dream until one of the vendors next to me whispered, "You saw him at night, didn't you?" And when I nodded, she just looked at me with this pity I can't explain, like someone visiting a hospice patient who doesn't know they're dying. And over the next few days, things started changing, not in big ways at first, but subtly. I'd glance at my reflection in the popcorn machine and see it smiling when I wasn't, or catch movement beneath the wooden slats of the boardwalk, even when the tide was low and the sand dry, and people stopped coming to my booth altogether. Even though I had one of the best spots near the midway, families would approach, stop, look confused, then walk away like they didn't see me. And one afternoon, a little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and said, "Why is the kettle corn man's face leaking?" And I touched my cheek and came away with a smear of translucent goo that smelled like old sugar and seawater. The health inspector came by the following week and said there had been complaints, said people reported as strange smells and a non-compliant behavior. And when I asked who filed them, looked confused and said he couldn't find the name on the paperwork, just a signature that looked like it had been scrawled in a spiral. And I started noticing more weird things then. My cart would be unlocked when I arrived in the morning, even though I double-checked it the night before. My cash drawer would be empty one day and overflowing the next with foreign coins and old tokens I'd never seen. And worst of all, I began to hear the music, the same warped version of "You Are My Sunshine," not from the taffy booth, but from the floor beneath my feet, from the wood itself. And once, when I leaned down to listen, I swear I heard whispering behind the song, a soft, wet voice repeating, "He never left, he never leaves, he never lets go." And I started dreaming of taffy, not the candy, but the texture, the pull, the sensation of being stretched and twisted and rolled flat. And in those dreams, I was always looking out through someone else's eyes, watching people pass from behind a counter I couldn't leave, my hands sticky and numb, my mouth sewn shut by sugar and grief. And I woke one night to find myself standing at the edge of the water, barefoot, shirtless, with strings of pale wax stuck to my hands and chest like I'd been submerged in the stuff. And from that night on, the ocean started to smell different, not salty, but sweet and rotten, like caramel left in the sun. And the waves didn't crash anymore. They hissed like boiling syrup. I quit the job the next morning, packed up and left town without telling anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really left, that something had attached itself to me. And when I stopped at a gas station 40 miles inland, the cashier looked up and asked, "Aren't you the guy from the boardwalk, one with the candy?" And when I asked what she meant, she said she remembered me from when she was a little girl, said I'd given her a taffy that turned her teeth black and made her dream about drowning. And I said that was impossible, that I'd never seen her before. But she just smiled sadly and said, "You've always been there, haven't you?" And I looked down at my hands and realized they were glistening again, coated in something I couldn't wash off, something that smelled like sugar and decay. And when I looked in the bathroom mirror, my reflection didn't move with me. It stared straight ahead, lips sealed, smiling with teeth like white worms curling in slow motion. And now I live nowhere, in motels mostly, but every time I close my eyes, I feel the pull, the stretch, the music crawling up my spine. And some nights I wake up and I'm behind a counter again, strangers passing by without seeing me, and the taffy pulling machine squealing beside me. And I think I was wrong when I thought the vendor never left, because I think he does leave, but only when someone else takes his place. If you're still here, still listening, then consider this your warning. Some places are not meant to be remembered, and others never let you forget. The boardwalks in these stories aren't just old planks of wood stretching over sand and sea. They're thresholds, thin places where the sea speaks and sometimes something answers. Those who vanish in the fog, who hear music playing long after midnight, who see booths lit long after they should be dark. They don't always come back, and if they do, they're not quite the same. So next time you walk the boardwalk at night and feel someone watching you from behind a shuttered stall, or hear a voice whisper beneath the waves, don't stop, don't turn around, and whatever you do, never accept candy after dark. Thank you for watching. Sleep if you can.